For nearly half a century, the world stood on the edge of annihilation. American and Soviet missiles were ready to launch at a moment's notice, yet they never did. How did humanity survive an era when one wrong move could have ended civilization? This is the untold story of how the Cold War stayed cold, and why it never became a hot war. The world on the edge, 1945-1947. The year was 1945. The Second World War had ended in fire and rubble. The United States stood victorious with its allies wielding the most destructive weapon in history, the atomic bomb. The Soviet Union, battered but unbroken, had emerged as a global superpower. Yet the peace was uneasy. The two nations had fought side by side against Nazi Germany, but their alliance was built on necessity, not trust. As Berlin fell, both sides were already preparing for the next struggle, a war for the future of the world. In Washington, leaders feared the spread of communism across war-torn Europe. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin saw the West's economic and military power as a threat to socialism's survival. The seeds of the Cold War were already in the ground, waiting for the right conditions to grow. By 1946, Winston Churchill gave his famous Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. He warned of a divided Europe, half free, half under Soviet control. The speech electrified the West and infuriated the East. In the Soviet Union, propaganda painted the United States as an imperialist aggressor. In the US, magazines, films, and politicians spoke of the Red Menace, a global conspiracy to enslave the free world. Fear was becoming the new currency of politics. The Truman Doctrine of 1947 declared America's intent to support free peoples resisting subjugation. This was more than a policy. It was a global promise and a warning to the Soviets. But here is the paradox. Even as the Cold War began, neither side truly wanted a hot war. Why? Because the destruction of World War II was still burned into memory, and both sides knew that a third world war could end human civilization. This unspoken fear became the invisible shield that would keep the Cold War cold, at least for now. Berlin, first test of nerves, 1948-1949. The city of Berlin was a powder keg. Though deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, the city itself was divided between the Allies and the Soviets. It was the one place where both sides stared each other down every single day. In June 1948, Joseph Stalin made his move. He cut off all rail, road, and canal access to West Berlin. 2 million residents suddenly found themselves trapped, their food and fuel supplies dwindling. The world watched, expecting American tanks to roll into East Germany. But instead of bullets, the US responded with airplanes. The Berlin airlift began, hundreds of cargo planes delivering supplies day and night for 11 months straight. It was a gamble. If the Soviets shot down a single plane, war could erupt instantly. But Stalin, perhaps unwilling to risk open conflict so soon after WP, held back. By May 1949, the blockade ended. The airlift had fed an entire city without a single shot fired. It was the first great victory of the Cold War, and proof that confrontation didn't always require direct combat. But it also showed something else. Both sides had limits. The line between peace and war was razor thin, and neither wanted to cross it. The Korean War, contained fire, 1950-1953. The Cold War almost turned hot in Korea. In June 1950, North Korean forces, backed by the Soviets and later China, stormed across the 38th parallel. The US and United Nations rushed to defend the South. American soldiers fought bloody battles from Pusan to Incheon, pushing the North back. But when General MacArthur advanced toward China's border, Chinese troops flooded into Korea, turning the tide. Suddenly, the war teetered on the brink of global catastrophe. President Truman faced a terrifying choice. MacArthur urged the use of nuclear weapons against Chinese forces. Truman refused, fearing it would ignite World War III. Instead, the conflict settled into a brutal stalemate. By 1953, an armistice was signed, but the war never officially ended. The Korean peninsula remains divided to this day. The lesson was clear. Even a regional war could spiral into a global nuclear disaster. From then on, both superpowers avoided direct battlefield clashes. Nuclear chess, the mad doctrine. By the mid-1950s, the nuclear arms race was in full swing. The US tested the hydrogen bomb. The Soviets followed. Each bomb was dozens of times more powerful than those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Military planners developed a chilling strategy: mutually assured destruction, MAD. If one side launched nuclear weapons, the other would respond with equal or greater force, guaranteeing both would be destroyed. It was a game of chicken with the highest possible stakes. War planners calculated kill ratios, fallout patterns, and how many millions would die in the first hour. The numbers were so catastrophic that even hardliners hesitated. Ironically, MAD kept the peace. It was a twisted form of security. The knowledge that war meant suicide made war unthinkable, but it also meant that any small mistake, false alarm, or miscommunication could end the world in minutes. Cuba, 13 days to midnight, 1962. In October 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than ever before. U.S. reconnaissance photos revealed Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. President Kennedy demanded their removal. For 13 days, the superpowers faced off. American warships blockaded Cuba. Soviet ships steamed toward them. Nuclear bombers were put on constant alert. Behind the scenes, diplomats worked frantically. Kennedy offered a secret deal. The U.S. would remove its missiles from Turkey if the Soviets pulled out of Cuba. On October 28th, Nikita Khrushchev agreed. The crisis ended without a shot fired, but for those 2 weeks, humanity held its breath. The Cuban Missile Crisis proved that clear communication and backchannel diplomacy could prevent war, even at the very edge of destruction. Proxy wars, fighting without meeting. Direct U.S.-Soviet war was avoided, but both powers fought indirectly. They armed, funded, and trained opposing sides in conflicts across the globe, in Vietnam, Angola, Afghanistan, and Latin America. Vietnam became the most infamous example. The U.S. fought a long, bloody war against North Vietnamese forces backed by the Soviet Union and China. Millions died, but U.S. and Soviet soldiers never faced each other directly. This was the unspoken rule of the Cold War: fight everywhere, except against each other. It was a brutal form of restraint. Proxy wars destroyed nations, but they kept the nuclear powers from open conflict. The spy war, shadows in the cold. While tanks and missiles stayed silent, the real war moved into the shadows. The CIA and KGB became the tip of the spear, waging battles of deception, sabotage, and intelligence gathering. In Moscow, double agents whispered state secrets in dimly lit cafes. In Washington, Soviet moles passed classified documents under park benches. Entire lives were lived in disguise, with betrayal often rewarded in gold or a bullet. One famous case was Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet colonel who secretly aided the West. His intelligence during the Cuban Missile Crisis may have prevented nuclear war, but when caught, the KGB executed him without mercy. The spy war was dangerous, but it was also a form of controlled conflict. Information was stolen, not cities. Lives were lost, but not civilizations. The nuclear near misses. The Cold War was full of terrifying false alarms. In 1983, Soviet radar detected incoming U.S. missiles. Protocol demanded immediate retaliation, but Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov hesitated. Petrov guessed it was a malfunction. He was right. Had he followed orders, hundreds of millions could have died. In 1961, a U.S. B-52 bomber broke apart over North Carolina, dropping 2 nuclear bombs. One came within a single faulty switch of detonating. These incidents showed how close the world came to destruction, not because of politics, but because of human error. Each time, restraint saved humanity. Détente. The Cold thaws slightly. 1970s. By the late 1960s, both sides realized the arms race was unsustainable. The cost was draining economies, and the risk of accidental war was too great. Thus began détente, a policy of easing tensions. The US and USSR signed arms control treaties like SALT-Y and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Trade increased. Cultural exchanges flourished. Nixon visited Moscow. Brezhnev visited Washington. The sight of an American president and a Soviet leader shaking hands seemed almost unthinkable a decade earlier. But détente was fragile. It could cool the war, but it could not end it. The Afghanistan quagmire. In 1979, Soviet troops invaded Afghanistan to support a communist government under threat. The U.S. saw an opportunity to bleed its rival. Through the CIA's Operation Cyclone, America funneled weapons and training to Afghan guerrillas, the Mujahideen. It became the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The war dragged on for a decade, draining Soviet resources and morale. Yet again, the superpowers fought indirectly. Soviet and American soldiers never faced each other, but their weapons did. The arms race resumes, 1980s. When Ronald Reagan entered the White House in 1981, détente was over. Reagan called the USSR an evil empire and launched a massive military buildup. The U.S. developed new missile systems and the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars. The Soviets, already economically strained, struggled to keep up. The tension rose, but even Reagan, despite his rhetoric, knew a hot war was unwinnable. His military buildup was as much about negotiation leverage as actual combat readiness. Able Archer. 83. The war that almost happened. In November 1983, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer. It simulated a full-scale nuclear war, complete with mock communications to launch missiles. The Soviets, paranoid and fearing a surprise attack, put their nuclear forces on high alert. Some in Moscow truly believed the U.S. was preparing to strike. For several days, the world teetered unknowingly on the brink. Then the exercise ended, and the danger passed, quietly, almost invisibly. Once again, restraint, and perhaps luck, kept the Cold War cold. Backchannel diplomacy. Official talks between superpowers were often public theater. The real progress happened in backchannels, secret meetings, letters, and unofficial emissaries. Sometimes, cultural exchanges played the role of diplomacy. A chess match between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky, a ballet performance in New York, a joint space mission. These softened public perceptions. Humanizing the enemy made it harder to justify war. The leaders might be rivals, but they were also human beings navigating the same mortal danger. The psychology of restraint. Why did not the Cold War become hot? Beyond politics, the psychology of leaders played a role. Stalin, Khrushchev, Kennedy, Nixon, Reagan, all faced moments when pulling the trigger might have been tempting. But each knew that in a nuclear war, there would be no winners. Even military commanders understood this grim truth. In modern war, victory meant radioactive ruins. This shared fear acted as a quiet, invisible treaty, more binding than any piece of paper. Europe as the pressure valve. Divided Germany and the NATO Warsaw Pact standoff in Europe were constant sources of tension, but strangely, they also acted as a pressure valve. Both sides stationed massive forces there, but never crossed the line. The presence of mutually overwhelming strength discouraged rash moves. Berlin remained a flashpoint, but also a reminder that even a single tank crossing the wrong line could end the world. The role of public opinion. By the 1970s and 80s, the public in both the US and USSR had grown weary of constant fear. Massive anti-nuclear protests erupted across Europe. In America, ban the bomb movements gained traction. In the Soviet Union, while public dissent was dangerous, whispers of discontent grew louder. Leaders could not ignore the people forever. Public opinion became yet another force, pulling both sides away from open war. Gorbachev and Reagan, a turning point. When Mikhail Gorbachev became Soviet leader in 1985, he brought a fresh approach: glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. He and Reagan met in a series of summits, including Reykjavik in 1986, where they discussed reducing nuclear arsenals. Though talks were tense, both leaders recognized they had a historic opportunity to end the standoff. By the late 1980s, US-Soviet relations warmed dramatically. The arms race slowed. Trust, while fragile, began to grow. The peaceful collapse. In 1989, communist regimes in Eastern Europe began to fall one after another. The Berlin Wall crumbled without a single shot fired between NATO and Warsaw Pact forces. By 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved. The Cold War ended, not with nuclear fire, but with political transformation. It was an ending few had imagined possible in 1945. The world exhaled, but the lessons of restraint remained. Why it stayed. Cold looking back, the Cold War never turned hot for three main reasons: mutually assured destruction, the certainty of total annihilation, indirect conflict, proxy wars instead of direct confrontation, communication, formal and informal channels that kept misunderstandings from spiraling into war. These forces worked together to keep humanity's deadliest weapons silent. Lessons for the future. The Cold War may be over, but nuclear weapons remain. The US, Russia, China, and other nations still possess the power to destroy the planet. The real lesson of the Cold War is that restraint is a choice. Leaders in the 20th century chose not to press the button. The question for the 21st century is, will we make the same choice? History's greatest victory may be the war that never happened, and it's a victory we must fight to preserve every single day.